Hello and welcome to this episode of This Much is True Crime with me, Martin Frizzell, and my friend and colleague, Emeritus Professor of Criminology, David Wilson. Hi, David.
Hey, Martin.
We've
We're
seen,
not in the studio.
yeah,
We've been,
we've seen quite a bit and spoken quite a bit with each other in the past couple of days. This is the second time we have recorded in 24 hours, pretty much, on the dreadful, shocking, incredibly moving case of poor Henry Nowak, the 18-year-old who was murdered in the street in Southampton just before Christmas last year. We had recorded it yesterday in our studio, and this was just as the sentencing was taking place at Southampton Crown Court. And we actually thought the body cam footage, which was quite an important, well, a very important part of this, and for which there had been pressure from people like Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, and politicians to release the body cam footage. But we thought the police were going to hold on to that because, of course, there's an independent police inquiry into the Hampshire Police's conduct on that evening. We thought they might be holding on to that. But I think Henry's family themselves requested and certainly approved of the footage being released overnight. So we've all seen it now, and I know you've seen it. And I had to stop myself from crying, actually, David, because you know what comes after the camera is not the camera switched off, but the tape ends for us to see that Henry dies, and he's lying there on his own with strangers and a stranger who's attacked him, and police who don't believe him, and he's handcuffed, and he can't breathe.
and he repeatedly says, and we've heard him now saying, I can't breathe. 9 times he says, I can't breathe. He says he's been stabbed. And one of the police officers who attends the scene says, I don't think so, mate. We've got to remember this is at midnight. It's dark. There was no blood that could be seen. And then, of course, increasingly it becomes obvious when he does lose consciousness that he has been stabbed. And you're right, it's an incredibly moving and tragic thing to witness because, of course, we are there because of the body cam footage. We are in the scene where that young man is going to lose his life. I feel very close to it myself. My daughter went to Southampton University. She lived in halls in her first year. She lived outside in her subsequent years. I know the area quite well as a consequence. And, it does come really close to home. But for me, Martin, for me, this is the tragedy. The tragedy is Henry's murder. And there's a compounded tragedy in relation to how a number of different people have seen it in their political interest to make comment about it. And the person who comes out with the greatest, I think, dignity is Henry's father, Mark, who says, this isn't about Sikhism, this isn't about racism, this is about murder. And yet, despite the fact that he's saying, don't make this more than it should be, because what it should be is about remembering Henry, a number of people have chosen to ignore that, and including, you've mentioned Elon Musk, Tommy Robinson, I saw, had his supporters outside Southampton police headquarters today. Nigel Farage has made comment. It seems to me that nobody's listening to what the Nowak family are saying,
No,
which
no,
is
yeah, which is some respect and some peace, and the problem here is knife crime, and also why was Henry treated the way he was when his killer Vicrum Digwa, as far as the family are concerned, wasn't handcuffed when he was arrested, and even in jail was offered a choice of food, whereas Henry was, as we saw, lying there and not believed by the police. I'm sorry, mate, don't think you are, says the police officer. It's interesting, 4 police officers at least were called to that scene. 3 are still on frontline duty. 1, we understand, has resigned from the police force. since this incident. And also, David, it was interesting. Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, announced in the Commons today, and I saw this myself on social media. Some quite militant characters had discovered a police officer from the Hampshire force, put his picture up, put his address up as well. And that police officer has had to move home now because he's had death threats, and he was not involved, according to the Home Secretary and to Hampshire Police, in the killing of Henry Nowak. But it just shows you, it just kind of runs wild on social media. But also for me, David, this is a story of two families, and certainly two sets of parents. And there was nothing more dignified than the Nowak family coming out on the steps of Southampton Crown Court. My God, you felt for them, and how they spoke with such eloquence, and the eulogies that, I hate the phrase witness statements. They were eulogies that were read out in court from the family. They all went there, and they had to withstand what was then, at the end of it, and Digwa was sentenced to 21 years. They had to hear the Digwa family or their supporters calling the judge racist. I mean, it just didn't stop. And so that was the family, the respectful family of Henry, compared to Digwa himself and his brother. Now, bear in mind, his brother had lied to the police. When he made the 999 call, he said that he used the word "we have been attacked" or "we have been racistly abused," including himself in this. That was a lie. He wasn't. That was a wicked lie, according to the judge as well. Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, called the killing an act of pure evil. Now, the family were there. So Digwa was there, his brother was there, his father was there, his mother was there at the scene with Henry bleeding to death. The mother took the murder weapon home. She's been convicted. She'll be up in court for sentencing in a few weeks' time. And then we hear as well today, David, that the brother and the father of Digwa, who were there at the scene, have now been charged with multiple weapons offences alongside Digwa himself. He was brought back from jail to court today because he's been accused with them. The father, Moga Singh, who's 52, the brother, Gurpreet Digwa, who's 27. They're accused of 6 counts of possessing an offensive weapon in a private place. And that includes possessing an axe, a knife, an air rifle, a kirpan. And this all happened the day after that Henry died. The house was raided by police, and in the house they found a flick knife, knuckle dusters, a machete, swords, and an expandable baton. Bigwa's been sent back to begin his sentence in jail, but the brother and father have been released on bail, pending a later court appearance. I mean, a lot of people will be saying, is there anything else that should be done with the father or the brother, certainly the brother, who lied to police? Is there not any kind of offence that maybe he should be considered to have caused because of, I don't know if Henry could have been saved or not. The pathologist seems to think perhaps not. But you just wonder, if they had told the police at the time straight away, he needs help, or they called up the ambulance and not the police. They didn't even call the ambulance service. They called the police service to say they had been assaulted.
We have to be really careful because charges have been brought about what we can say in relation to these other matters that you've drawn attention
Well, we can
to.
say the brother's a liar because he was a liar. That's confirmed, and that's in the record books. That's in open court. The brother lied on that 999 call.
And it's the 999 call that would have given the call handler that's going to direct the police that are going to go to this incident information in relation to what they knew about that incident. And in that 999 call, he says that his brother had been racially attacked. And therefore, when those police officers go to the incident, that's the information that they have. Now, as you have drawn attention to, this is now for the IOPC. The matter was referred to the IOPC, Independent Office of Police Complaints, and what they will have to decide is that they will have to decide about the information that was provided. They will have to decide why the attending officers chose to handcuff as opposed to treat. And there will be other issues that I'm sure that the IOPC will want to investigate. and in particular, the idea of two-tier policing, which one has heard repeatedly in the wake of the release of the body camera footage. So there are a number of issues that are still going to have to be determined. Um, but the thing I like to come back to in relation to all of this is where we started, which is to think about the fact that Henry was surrounded by the people who were lying, and the police were believing that family, and he was pointing out repeatedly that he'd been stabbed and he wasn't being believed. And of course, by him saying, I can't breathe, that is almost a direct echo of what happens to George Floyd in Minneapolis and Minnesota when Derek Chauvin, the police officer, is kneeling on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes, 29 seconds, repeatedly saying, I can't breathe. The difference between, of course, that incident and what happens in Southampton is in Minneapolis, there were lots of witnesses. There were people saying, why are you behaving like that? They were taking footage of what was happening. That's not what happens here. Henry was very much by himself on his own and disbelieved in relation to the fact that he was the victim as opposed to what was being claimed by Digwa. And it feels just impossible for him, and one's heart went out in terms of witnessing what was happening to him on that night. He was 18. This is a young man on the verge of the rest of his life, and it's taken away from him in the most tragic and appalling of circumstances.
Again, if you listen to the eulogies from his family, I mean, especially his big sister, Olivia, and on social media, she posted on her Facebook page a beautiful video of her
Yeah.
and her brother being goofy. And even sort of, takes my breath away just thinking about it and talking about it. And he loved Coldplay, the band, and Yellow was his favorite tune. And so she's put it onto that. She and the rest of the family were driven mad by him constantly singing Adele. But everyone who knew him said that he lit up a room. He was well loved by his football team. He played for 2 football teams at university. He was in his first year. He's the first person in his family to go to university. They found out on holiday in Greece the year before that he was going there. He was so made up to do that. I mean, what an absolute waste. And just to come back to the George Floyd thing, where it's different, David, is of course that the critics will be saying and are saying now, where was the outpouring of protest and outrage in this country for Henry's death? Where were the politicians taking the knee? Where have been the demonstrations in the street? And so this is only beginning, I think. You have the family calling for peace and for an inquiry into knife crime and into what happened to their son. But you have Nigel Farage calling for rage. He and his supporters are incensed by this. And it's hard not to be, quite frankly. That boy should never have been handcuffed. That boy should never have been arrested. He should have been helped. The first thing those police should have done when they arrived was to work out what was going on. Sure, they get a radio message to say, go to the scene. And they didn't know. They hadn't been told there was a stabbing involved. Although having said that, there was another 999 call, I think, from the people who were, in the flats where Henry was eventually found lying, who did say, we hear someone shouting they've been stabbed. So that was within the police control room. Now, I don't know if they were told, and the inquiry will find out if they've been told that there was someone going there. But initially, you're right, they couldn't see that Henry had been bleeding badly.
You were giving some background to Henry there, and rightly so. And I know he was a great football fan and played football, and he was an Arsenal supporter. And just think, it's only a matter of a few days ago that Arsenal were celebrating winning the championship, and so you kind of think, or the Premier League. I always get the titles wrong, but
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, he'd have loved all that. And actually, there is a charity. So his sister and the family friends are, keeping his, not forgotten at 18. They're keeping his legacy going. And there's a charity football match in the next few weeks. And you can just Google Henry Nowak, and you'll find directions to that. And so they're trying to raise money for charity. At this point, David, we should just ask, because this is more true crime than any true crime we could normally do, I presume. This is a true crime, and we are actually sponsored with partners by the True Crime Channel, who I know some of your programs appear on. And certainly in daytime, Judge Judy is there for anybody to see. It's the best daytime television there is quite out there, and I've worked in daytime a few times. And in the afternoons especially, it's a great watch. But also at nighttime, what's good about the True Crime Channel is that they're episodic in the terms of from start to finish, you get it in, one go. You don't have to wait for, 3 episodes to finally get the denouement or the kind of conclusion. It's there. It's bite-sized chunks.
And I would also say that the True Crime Channel is authoritative. It's led by experts. It's investigatory. I usually draw attention to Dr. Julia Shaw, a wonderful forensic psychologist, and Donald McIntyre, an investigative journalist. So there are people that I absolutely respect leading programs on the True Crime Channel. And we should also give a shout out at this point to our Patreon members,
Yeah.
Martin, shouldn't we? Because, if people want a bit more of us talking about these things and other things that we do specifically for our Patreon members, that they are able to join that as well for about the price of a cup of coffee for a month.
Exactly. So all the details are below as you can sign up, and we'd love you to be Patreon members. In fact, we did a recording last week where our inner circle Patreon members actually watched us record live. I don't know if they got me brushing my hair or I wasn't putting myself in the mirror or anything like that, but you can watch us record live, and that's an extra bonus. And also then there's Q&As, and we love taking questions, and we love answering those as well. And as I said, quite frankly, in terms of true crime, I mean, this crime, Henry's crime, will be spoken about for years to come. There will be documentaries, there are going to be dramas about this too. But Professor, what there will also be, and as we're waiting for it now, hopefully not too long, there'll be an inquiry into the police, and also questions being asked in terms of the mindset of police these days. Have the anti-racist learnings gone too far?
Well, and I saw that the Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp was drawing attention to some of the things that were written in relation to the advice, the anti-racist advice that the police are supposedly guided by, and saying, and it was quite clear that some of the language in what had been written was a bit clumsy, and that probably does need to be looked at. There are a number of things that are going to emerge from what happens to Henry, it seems to me, and quite apart from is there such a thing as two-tier policing? Remember, two-tier policing is first mentioned in respect of the protests that took place in this country as a result of George Floyd being murdered by a police officer in the United States. And you saw in the reaction in this country a number of police officers taking the knee. And therefore, this idea of two-tier policing, the idea that some groups will be policed differently from other groups, is inbuilt now into how the story of Henry's murder is beginning to be told. And I therefore go back to a couple of things. The first is that that's not what his family have said this is about. They've said this isn't about racism, this isn't about Sikhism, this is about a murder. And therefore, I want Henry and the Nowak family to be at the forefront of how they would like this to be dealt with. And again, Henry's father, Mark, has said this should be about knife crime. This should be about how we deal with knife crime in this country. And in relation to that, of course, there's going to be a huge debate, and already that debate has started about the Kirpan. Clearly, the Kirpan is one of the 5Ks. It's central to a Sikh's belief, but mostly it's symbolic. The Kirpan is a dagger that can be worn round the neck. It's a tiny, tiny symbol of a dagger, and a dagger is usually to protect people, not to attack people. That's what the symbol is meant to convey. And quite clearly, there will be people saying that if you're trying to get knives off the streets, you're going to have to do something about the Kirpan.
Well, this was a
And I
Shastar,
saw
though.
the
So
Sikh
this, I,
Federation came out talking about that today.
I mean, you're right. The Kirpan, it seems to be almost, it covers quite a large range of knives, to be honest. And this was a Shastar. So Kirpans are usually quite smaller. They can be any size. Legally, they can be any size. It's what you do with them is the illegal thing about it. If it's not being used for a ceremonial purpose, if you use it in self-defense or anything, then it becomes an offensive weapon. But it could be any size. And this was a Shastar, which is a large Kirpan. This was 8 inches, more than 20 centimeters that the killer was using. And so there will be this discussion now. Shall we just not have that goes to our ski and do's, being Scots. Of course, we're ski and do's in
Yeah.
Scottish traditional dress in your socks. Should we do away with ski and do's too? I would say uh, I do away with all of it, like Denmark has. So there's no excuse for having an offensive weapon. A knife is an offensive weapon unless you are genuinely allowed to have one, and religious beliefs and reasons are not a genuine reason.
Well, and it's not just Denmark. There's also France won't allow the carrying of a Kirpan. Italy, similarly, and also Belgium. I think what we should do, though, is rather than knee jerk into making a decision about that, is just let's reflect, let's breathe out, let's reflect on what's been happening, and let's actually think about that issue in the round. As you were also saying, remember the ski and do would be seen as an offensive weapon. We're coming up to the World Cup. I'm sure lots of Scots are going to be wearing traditional dress. And as part of our traditional dress, they would wear the ski and do within the sock. So it is about seeing these things in the round. I note, though, that Henry's father, Mark, was saying that the legacy of his son should be about a debate about knife crime in the country. And that seems to me to be an appropriate thing to discuss. I just don't want what's happened to Henry to be hijacked in some way and made into a kind of culture war issue, which is in danger of what's happening at the moment, is being hijacked by the culture warriors of various types.
You just hope that calm heads prevail. I mean, who knows where it goes? It's been dreadful weather today. The rain is always a good dampener on hot heads. If the weather picks up and it gets warmer again, who knows where it might lead? I thought it was interesting that Kemi Badenoch came out today saying it's not about Black Lives Matter or White Lives Matter. We all matter.
And that is absolutely right. And all that anybody should want is that our police should be treat everyone fairly. It should be dispassionate. And one feels that that isn't what people imagine have happened. We've mentioned Henry's father, Mark, once or twice, who I thought was incredibly dignified. Can I also say that somebody I found dignified was the Deputy Chief Constable of Hampshire, a man called Robert France. And Robert France said, and I'm quoting him directly, so forgive me for reading. He says, "I'm really sorry that Henry was arrested and handcuffed just before he lost consciousness. Officers attended a complicated and confusing situation, and lies were told in the 999 call. It's the whole picture that I'd ask people to consider." And that's really what we need to remember. We need to consider the whole picture. And I do have concerns for the officers that attended that scene because they were being given information about what had happened. It was late at night. It was dark. They've got an entire family almost descending on them, saying that they were being the ones that were the victims. And the poor lad who actually was the victim and lying and only minutes away from dying was simply not believed. It was a confused and complicated situation. And all we care about, surely, is that we have police that police not on the basis of the optics, but police who police on the basis of the facts before them. And I kind of got the impression that we're losing a lot of that debate because too many people are now hijacking this issue for different reasons.
I hear what you say about the deputy chief constable. Where was the chief constable? Has he had on his patch a bigger story, a bigger controversial issue than this? Not that I'm aware of in my time of reporting in Hampshire or the Isle of Wight. Never been as anything as big as this. Where was the chief constable? And I know what you're saying about they're saying it was a complex situation when they arrived. I've heard other ex-officers who've been on the radio and phone-ins saying actually they've been to much more chaotic scenes like this. This didn't seem like a chaotic scene. When they got there, Henry was being propped up or was on the ground. There wasn't a melee. There weren't people fighting. This was actually quite quiet and controlled. So I'm not, may well have been complex in terms of someone was telling a lie, but it certainly wasn't chaotic.
And one of the things that the IOPC will have to determine is why was Henry arrested and handcuffed? That would be the first thing that the IOPC investigation would try to determine. Um, I think the other thing would be, though, is why believe what they, but when their mindset when they went to that scene would be the information that they were given from the call handler that directed them to that scene. And that information, the intelligence from the call handler, would have come from the 999 call. Now, in my experience, which of course is limited in terms of what we've been discussing, but in my experience, it's never the perpetrator who does the 999 call. It would be the victim that was doing the 999 call. And hence, I suppose, the balance would have been tipped to believing that the perpetrator was actually the victim, as opposed to the victim was
Yeah.
actually
And
Henry.
And I just wonder, had they asked for the ambulance service, or they could have asked for both, but for ambulance certainly had they, and they knew that Henry had been stabbed because the mother had taken the knife away, so they knew it had been used. Had they asked for at least medical help, who knows? I know the pathologist said his wounds were so grave that he's probably going to die anyway with medical help, but you just don't know. At least he could have had a chance, and quite frankly, it wasn't that family's choice not to. They should have called for an ambulance. And even when the police got there, they denied he'd been stabbed as well. So they made the police have to call for the ambulance themselves.
And so those were all aggravating factors. And those aggravating factors were taken into consideration by the judge when he passed sentence. And I saw already there's been a campaign to say the sentence needs to be reviewed. And of course, that will go to the Attorney General in relation to was 21 years. He got a life sentence. He was convicted of murder, got a life sentence, a minimum tariff of 21 years before he can be considered for parole. Now, so there are people saying that's too light, but let's see what the Attorney General says in terms of whether or not that sentence did reflect the gravity and the mitigating and aggravating factors of the case.
Well, the mitigating factor was that he hadn't been in trouble with the law before. I think he had been in trouble with his own Sikh community before, but he hadn't been in trouble with the law before. And I think that the general tariff on that kind of a really quite violent, aggravated attack could well have been 25 years he could have got, but he didn't get that. And I think it's Nigel Farage who's certainly written to the Attorney General. And anybody can write, as we've actually discovered before when we did the story of the teenage rapists. Any member of the public can write to the Attorney General saying this was an unduly lenient sentence and could he review it, which he is doing with the teenage rapists. He's referring it to the Court of Appeal. And the same may well happen with this case.
And I saw there, again, going back to Henry's father was saying justice had been done. And, one's heart goes out to that family and also one's admiration for them, because what they're trying to get people to concentrate on is the tragedy of the murder of their son and making that tragedy means something in the broader cultural sense. And they're not wanting the murder of their son in the broader cultural sense to be hijacked by culture warriors saying, here's another example of two-tier policing. What they're wanting is a debate about knife crime in the country. And now that debate about knife crime in the country is quite clearly going to have to include what about the Kirpan? What about the skiing do? It has to have that element to it. But that seems to me to be a tiny matter in the broader scheme of what the family was saying they wanted Henry's murder to make us think about as a culture, as a country.
And something has to come out of it. So it's such a waste of a life. But let's hope there's something can come out of it. And I don't know about you, but whenever I hear these stories or cover these stories, you do, no matter what age they are, you tend to hold your children closer once you've seen and heard it, and just thank God for the fact that our kids have managed to live as long as they have so far. When poor Henry and his family, 18 years old, not forgotten that 18 is their motto. Quite right.
And and as I say, I felt a great proximity to what was happening and what was being said because my daughter went to that university. I'd like to hear something from Southampton University about what Southampton University are going to say in relation to what happened to Henry. So there are lots of ripples that have to work their way out in terms of what's going on and how we can make Henry's life mean something as a consequence of how he died. And that doesn't mean to say that we have to make this all about two-tier policing or DEI or whatever it is that we're wanting, other people are wanting us to consider. We just need to keep remembering this is about the murder of a 18-year-old boy on the beginning of the rest of his life, and it was cut dreadfully, tragically short.
And as his sister said, when she looked at Digwa across the courtroom, she said, "I wish you'd known my brother. You would never have done this to him because he was the most, fun, uh, goofy, annoying, but wonderful, young brother anyone could have wished for." When you hear all all the eulogies about him, I'd love to have gone for a drink with him, although he didn't drink much. And on the night as well, he wasn't that drunk. If he was drunk at all, he was below the drink driving limit, although his friends said, he was known as a light drinker. He didn't drink much. But he's the kind of kid I'd love to have had a chat with. He seems really sweet. We have to leave it there, Professor. Can we just thank again our sponsors, the True Crime Channel? You've got
Yeah.
a show on there just now.
Because if you like true crime, and why wouldn't you? You're going to love the True Crime channel. So we always grateful to them. And we also want to make a shout out for our Patreon members. Thank you as well for becoming one of our Patreon subscribers. And that does mean that you will get access to other things that
Yeah.
we'll discuss. And
Yeah.
can I also say this is one of the reasons why we do the podcast, because we want the podcast to be about something that's emerging in the community about crime. And here was a real example of us trying to respond to what was being said almost in the moment. The release of the body cam footage, because as you were revealing, Martin, we had done our recording in the studio yesterday, but the release of the body cam footage meant that we wanted to do this again and respond to that.
And our extra episode on Patreon is, guess what? It's about Nicola Sturgeon's thieving husband, who's been up in court today as well and will be sentenced in a few weeks' time. But it's a fascinating case. It's just silly what went on there. Silly and quite astonishing.
And the motorhome, which of course there were more details about the motorhome given today in the agreed narrative between the defense and the prosecution in Scotland. And we discovered that the motorhome, which was kitted out and everything, £125,000, how far had it traveled? 4 miles. The things that Murrow was buying with the money that was being embezzled were quite clearly not important to him. The embezzlement was about making a different point. The embezzlement was about saying, I am not being respected. I no longer, I'm not being given the credit that I should be given.
Well, he's
And
going
of course, as he was led in today, handcuffed,
yeah,
it was just quite an extraordinary scene.
and he's going to jail. Just a question of for how long. And I'm sure he knows this, but Amazon don't deliver there. Professor, for the time being, thank you until our next episode.
Take care.
Bye.